Hey guys, tonight we're beginning with one of my favorite corners of history. The kind of story you don't usually hear in textbooks. Because, well, textbooks like clean narratives, and this one is anything but clean. So go ahead, dim the lights, pull the blanket up, maybe take a sip of water or whatever bedtime drink you're nursing tonight, and let's drift back in time to the long, slow centuries when battlefields were very loud, but history only wrote them down in whispers. Because tonight, we're talking about the women who slipped into armor, cut their hair, and marched off to war pretending to be men. Now, right away, your brain probably goes, wait, that happened a lot? And the answer is, oh yes, more than you'd expect. It turns out that while kings, dukes, and generals were busy drafting very stern rules about who could and couldn't fight, plenty of women just shrugged and went, yeah, well, rules are more like suggestions. Then they grabbed a helmet, shoved their breasts into a chest binder made of whatever cloth they could find, and introduced themselves as a young man ready to serve. And remarkably, most of the time, it worked. Of course, we're not talking about glamorous movie disguises. There was no slow-motion hair-cutting montage with epic music in the background. In real life, the disguises were shabby, messy, often obvious, and yet people didn't question too much. Because here's the thing about armies before modern bureaucracy. No one was exactly running background checks. If you showed up with 2 working arms, a bit of attitude, and maybe a forged baptism certificate, chances are they signed you up. And once you were in, life was mud, sweat, disease, and occasionally someone trying to stick a sword in your stomach. So honestly, most of your fellow soldiers didn't care if you shaved awkwardly or had a suspiciously high voice. They were too busy trying not to die. But for the women themselves, the reasons for joining were never simple. Some wanted freedom. Some wanted revenge. Some wanted money. And some probably just thought, why not? It beats laundry. Let's float first to the 17th century. A Dutch woman named Cornelia Gerritsdochter van Brederode, or as she was better known when she put on a uniform, Cornelis. Cornelia slipped into men's clothing and enlisted in the Dutch army. And not just for a weekend adventure. She actually served for years. She fought in sieges, carried a musket, and apparently did it all well enough that no one thought to question the scrappy boy fighting alongside them, until, of course, she died in battle. And then came the great reveal. Imagine the awkward silence when her comrades realized their fellow soldier had been a woman the entire time, and history just sort of shuffled her name into the margins. Another, oh, that was odd footnote. But she wasn't alone. Stories like hers pop up across Europe, almost like stubborn weeds in the neat lawn of men fight wars, women stay home. Take Catalina de Arauso, better known as the Lieutenant Nun. She was born in Spain around 1592, and if her life had been a Netflix show, you'd think the writers were overdoing it. Catalina was put in a convent as a girl, But she wasn't exactly thriving under the whole nuns and prayers lifestyle. So one day, she cut her hair, stole some boys' clothes, and walked right out the door. And she never looked back. Disguised as a man, she traveled through Spain and then shipped out to the Americas, the Spanish colonies, where life was violent, chaotic, and brimming with opportunities for someone bold enough to take them. Catalina fought as a soldier in Chile, brawled in taverns, killed more than one man in duels, and somehow managed to keep her identity secret through it all. At least, until she didn't. After years of adventures, she finally revealed she was actually a woman. But here's the twist. Instead of punishing her, the Spanish king, and even the Pope, gave her permission to keep living as a man. Because apparently, once you've fought enough battles and stabbed enough people, society just sort of shrugs and says, "Fine, you win." She lived out her later years, running a business in Mexico, still dressed as a man, still calling herself by her male name. Her story is wild, but told in that slow, sleepy rhythm. You can see the pattern. A woman boxed in by convent walls, who found her way out by putting on breeches and pretending to be a soldier. Now, let's float further north, to Britain in the 18th century. Here we meet Hannah Snell. Hannah's life started fairly ordinary. Born in 1723, married young, and then abandoned by her husband, which, if you're noticing a trend, is often the backstory for these women. Stuck, cheated, or left behind. But Hannah wasn't content to just fade quietly. Instead, she borrowed a set of men's clothes, changed her name to James Gray, and enlisted in the Royal Marines. She served in India of all places, fighting in the heat and grit of colonial campaigns. At one point, she was even shot in the leg. And rather than risk discovery by a doctor, she apparently dug out the bullet herself, alone, quietly. Imagine the grit that took to sit there in penance, performing amateur surgery on yourself, because admitting you were female might mean humiliation, prison, or worse. Eventually, after years of service, she returned to England and revealed the truth. But unlike Cornelia, she didn't just fade into a footnote. She actually became a minor celebrity. She performed on stage, telling her story to fascinated crowds. The army even granted her a pension, which was their way of saying, "Okay, yes, technically you weren't supposed to be here, but thanks anyway." And then there's Deborah Sampson, across the Atlantic, born in Massachusetts in 17 Deborah was poor, restless, and living in a society that offered women about 3 career options: wife, servant, or nun. And she wasn't thrilled with any of them. So, during the American Revolutionary War, she disguised herself as a man named Robert Shirtliff and enlisted in the Continental Army. She marched, fought, dug trenches, and endured all the same brutal conditions as her male comrades. At one point, she was slashed across the forehead by a sword, and at another, she was shot in the leg. And just like Hannah Snell, she secretly treated her own wounds rather than risk discovery. But eventually, the secret slipped. Her health declined, and during treatment, doctors realized Robert Shirtliff wasn't exactly Robert. And here's the almost comic part. Instead of being punished, she was quietly discharged with honor. Later, she petitioned Congress for a pension, which, after years of paperwork and hesitation, she finally received, making her one of the very few officially recognized female soldiers of the Revolutionary era. You can see the lull of it now. One story after another, different countries, different wars, but the same rhythm. A woman, trapped in the narrow cage of her time, puts on men's clothes. She enlists. She marches. She bleeds. She keeps the secret until her body or her circumstances give her away. Sometimes she dies in battle, revealed only in death. Sometimes she lives to tell the tale, and very occasionally she even earns respect for it. But in most cases, history let them slip quietly back into the shadows. And there's something almost dreamlike about that. The image of them sitting by campfires, voices blending in with the men around them, faces half hidden in the smoke, soldiers who weren't quite soldiers, women who became men not by identity or choice of gender as we'd think today, but by necessity. It was survival, it was escape, it was stubbornness, and now, hundreds of years later, their names drift up like ghosts. Catalina, Hannah, Deborah, Cornelia. They remind us that history isn't just kings with bad jaws, or queens trapped in arranged marriages. It's also these forgotten people, slipping between categories, refusing to stay where society put them. And that's where we'll pause for now, because in part 2, we'll keep drifting deeper. We'll meet more of these women, from sailors who swore like men, to Napoleonic soldiers who marched under the weight of secrets, and will let their quiet rebellions rock us gently through history's long night. So, close your eyes. The battlefields are fading, the campfires are glowing low, and the voices of forgotten soldiers are settling into silence. Hey again. If you're still awake, first of all, impressive. Most people would have drifted off somewhere around Habsburg Jaw or digging out your own musket ball. But since you're here, let's sink a little deeper. Because women disguised as men in war didn't just haunt battlefields, they also slipped onto ships. And let's be honest, war on land was miserable enough. War at sea, even worse. Imagine weeks or months crammed into a damp wooden coffin with sails. The smell of unwashed sailors, rotting food, and whatever was sloshing around in the bilge water below deck. Honestly, you could be the most observant officer alive, and you still might not notice that young lad swabbing the deck was actually a woman, mostly because you were too busy gagging. One of the most famous of these sea-bound women was Mary Lacy. Born in 1780, she decided domestic life wasn't for her. At 19, she borrowed a man's clothes, renamed herself William Chandler, and enlisted in the Royal Navy. Now, unlike a lot of the women we've already drifted past, Mary wasn't there to fight in glory-soaked naval battles. She trained as a shipwright's apprentice, which basically meant endless hours sawing, hammering, and crawling around in the guts of wooden ships. Not glamorous, but it paid. So let's rest here for a moment. The drums of the Civil War are fading, the guns are falling silent, and the disguised soldiers are settling back into their tents, pulling blankets up against the cold. In part 4, we'll drift even further, to other corners of the world, to forgotten medieval ballads, to women in disguise during revolutions and uprisings you've probably never heard of. But for now, let the silence of the camp lull you. The secrets are safe. The night is long, and history is whispering softly. In medieval Europe, ordinary women slipping into men's clothes to join armies didn't always leave behind court records or pension files. What they did leave were ballads, popular songs, tavern tunes, stories sung by traveling minstrels. There's an entire category of these songs known as the female warrior ballads. The formula goes something like this. 1. A woman, often poor or abandoned, cuts her hair and dresses as a man. 2. She enlists in the army or navy. 3. She serves bravely, sometimes even outshining her male comrades. 4. Eventually she is revealed, either by accident, by injury, or when she voluntarily shows her true self. 5. The ballad ends either with marriage, tragedy, or eternal glory. One famous example from the 17th century is the song of Sweet Polly Oliver. It tells of a girl who disguises herself to follow her lover into the army. She fights alongside him, proves her courage, and is eventually discovered, not with anger, but with admiration. These ballads weren't history in the strict sense. They were entertainment, but they reflect something real. The idea of the woman warrior in disguise was so common, so imaginable, that people sang about it in pubs, over and over again. That means, behind the songs, there must have been real women doing this. Enough of them to make the idea familiar. Enough to turn it into folklore. The Jacobite rebel. Now, let's step into 18th century Scotland. The Jacobite risings were a series of rebellions aiming to restore the Stuart dynasty to the throne of Britain. They were bloody, desperate, and full of disguises, and in their ranks were women. One of the most famous was Christian Kit Kavanagh, also known as Mother Ross. Her story begins not in Scotland, but in Ireland. When her husband deserted her, she disguised herself as a man, enlisted in the British Army, and spent years campaigning across Europe, from the Netherlands to Spain. She fought at the Battle of Blenheim in 1704, where she was wounded but not discovered. Eventually, her true identity came to light, but instead of punishment, she was celebrated. The Duke of Marlborough himself praised her bravery, and she was granted a pension. Later, she joined the army again during the Jacobite campaigns. Still in disguise, still fighting, she became a legend, a living example of the ballad tradition, only this time in flesh and blood. The Dutch Sailor Girl. Sailing north, we find the story of Mary Lacy, an 18th century English woman who disguised herself as a boy named William Chandler. Mary was apprenticed as a shipwright in the Royal Navy. She worked, studied, and learned the craft for years. When she was eventually revealed, her superiors were impressed rather than scandalized. They even granted her a pension in recognition of her service. Her memoir, published later in life, describes the difficulties of maintaining her disguise, how she had to mimic male gestures, control her voice, and carefully guard her privacy. But her story also reveals something more. Women weren't only disguising themselves to fight. Sometimes they did it to work, to get access to trades, ships, or salaries otherwise denied to them. The uniform wasn't just armor, it was a ticket into a forbidden world. The French Revolution's shadow. Now, the French Revolution is usually remembered for guillotines, pamphlets, and powdered wigs, flying into baskets. But beneath all that chaos, women in disguise were moving quietly through the crowds. One striking example is Marie-Thérèse Figuier, known as La Sans Gêne. She disguised herself as a man to enlist in the Revolutionary Army in the 1790s. She fought in several campaigns, including against Austria, and later served under Napoleon himself. Her disguise wasn't always perfect. Records suggest some of her comrades knew she was a woman, but that didn't matter. She had proved herself in a battle, and in the fervor of revolutionary France, that was enough. Later in life, she dictated her memoirs, though heavily edited and romanticized by her publisher. Still, her story shines through. She fought because she wanted to, because the revolution promised freedom, and she seized it. Mary kept the disguise going for over a decade. She even became a master shipwright, a skilled and respected trade. Eventually, her health declined, and she came clean. Instead of punishing her, the Admiralty actually granted her a pension, which says a lot. Either they were impressed, or just too tired to argue. Mary later published a memoir under her own name, which means her story survived in her own words, a rare gift in this hazy corner of history. But while Mary's tale feels almost wholesome, most weren't. Take the story of Anne Bonny and Mary Read, the infamous pirate pair. Now, yes, they weren't strictly soldiers. They weren't enlisted in a king's army or a navy with uniforms and paperwork. They were pirates, which meant no paperwork, no rules, and a whole lot of rum. Mary Read's story began in disguise. As a child, her mother dressed her as a boy to claim inheritance money. Later, Mary carried on the act, joining the British Army under the name Mark Read. She fought, camped, and drilled alongside men. Eventually, she fell in love with a fellow soldier and revealed her secret. He married her, and they left the army. Sadly, he died young, and Mary, needing income again, put the breeches back on. This time, she ended up aboard a ship, and through a series of twists, she wound up a pirate, serving under Calico Jack Rackham, alongside another disguised woman, Anne Bonny. The two of them became legendary, not just because they fought fiercely, but because, according to some accounts, they fought harder than most of the men. During one famous skirmish, when their crew was too drunk to defend the ship, it was Mary and Anne who kept swinging their swords until they were finally overpowered, captured. Both women were sentenced to hang, but when they revealed they were pregnant, the execution was delayed. Mary died in prison. Anne's fate is less clear. Some say she was quietly released. Others think she slipped back into obscurity. Either way, their stories blurred the lines between warrior, criminal, and woman in disguise. And like so many others, they were remembered mostly because their reveal caused a scandal. Now, let's drift a little further into the Napoleonic Wars. The early 19th century, Europe was a mess. Armies were ballooning and recruitment was frantic, which meant, once again, fewer questions asked. And into that chaos stepped Nadezhda Durova of Russia. Born into a military family, Nadezhda hated the roles expected of her, so she dressed as a man, adopted the name Alexander Sokolov, and enlisted in the Russian cavalry. She wasn't just a passable soldier. She was good, brave in battle, skilled on horseback, admired by her comrades. Eventually, her disguise slipped, but instead of punishment, something remarkable happened. Tsar Alexander IV personally gave her permission to continue serving as a man. She fought in major battles against Napoleon, earning decorations. Later, she even wrote a memoir, which still exists today, describing her adventures and the strange double life she lived. Nadezhda's story stands out because she wasn't erased or punished. She became a kind of national curiosity, though of course, much of society still muttered behind her back, confused about how to categorize her. But for every Nadezhda, Hannah, or Deborah who left behind memoirs and pensions, there were dozens who slipped back into silence. Most weren't caught because of wounds or scandals. They were caught because of the tiny, everyday moments. A cough in the wrong tone, an accidental glimpse while bathing, a slip of a name in a letter. One French case from the Napoleonic era tells of a woman who served quietly for years, until one day she fainted on parade. A doctor examined her, and the secret was out. She was discharged quietly, without punishment. But her name was never even recorded. She became just another whisper in the margins. And if you think about it, that's the real rhythm here. It's not the battles. It's not the medals or the muskets. It's the monotony. Imagine trudging along a muddy road with an army day after day, sleeping in crowded tents, eating whatever hard biscuits or salty meat they threw your way, trying to keep your disguise while surrounded by men who smelled as bad as you did. The fear wasn't glamorous. It wasn't even dramatic. It was slow, constant. That dull tension of being found out during the most ordinary of moments. And somehow, they did it. They survived. They marched. They fought. Let's pause on one of the quieter, stranger tales. Dr. James Barry. Now, technically, Barry wasn't a soldier in disguise. But Barry was an army surgeon in the British military, serving across the empire in the 19th century. And for Barry's entire career, decades of it, the army believed he was a man. Only when Barry died was the truth revealed. Barry had been born female. It wasn't until late in life, when Albert was elderly and injured, that doctors discovered the truth. Biologically, Albert had been born female, but by then, the story had settled. The army quietly continued paying his pension. Fellow veterans defended him, and Albert Cashier was buried under his chosen name, with full military honors. His story feels different from many others, less like a temporary disguise, more like a lifelong identity, which, of course, makes modern historians wonder, was Albert simply surviving, or was this how he always wanted to live? The answer, like so much in this sleepy corner of history, is murky. Then there were the anonymous ones, women who enlisted, fought, and were only discovered when they were wounded or killed. Doctors' reports from battlefield hospitals sometimes note the shock of treating a young soldier who turned out not to be male at all. Some Confederate records describe women's bodies found among the dead after battles, still in uniform, their names lost. These women never had memoirs, never had pensions. They simply melted back into the mud of history. One of the stranger stories belongs to Frances Clayton, who enlisted alongside her husband in a Minnesota regiment. She called herself Jack Williams. Together they marched, fought, and endured camp life. During one battle, her husband was killed right beside her. Frances kept fighting, never breaking cover. Later, she continued serving until she, too, was eventually discovered. Think about that. Marching shoulder to shoulder with your spouse, both of you pretending to be men, both sharing the disguise. There is something oddly romantic about it. Romantic in the bleak, muddy, Civil War trench sort of way. And the motivations? They were as varied as the women themselves. Some followed husbands or lovers into war, unwilling to be left behind. Others were running from family, debts, or bad marriages. Some wanted adventure, some wanted money, and some, we suspect, simply felt more comfortable as men, even if society didn't have the language for that yet. But whatever the reason, they all ended up in the same place, shouldering rifles, enduring marches, sleeping on the ground, trying not to be found out while surrounded by thousands of men. It's worth pausing here, because the day-to-day logistics of these disguises are almost more fascinating than the battles. How do you keep a secret like that in an army camp? Bathing? Rare. So that helped. Uniforms were baggy, hiding curves, and most soldiers didn't exactly strip down in front of each other anyway, especially in cold weather. Voices? Many women passed as teenage boys, which explained higher pitches. Facial hair? Not everyone had it, especially the younger recruits. And in an age before ID photos, no one asked too many questions. The real challenge was injury or illness. Once you ended up in a hospital bed, secrets had a way of unraveling, which is why so many were discovered that way. And yet, for hundreds, maybe thousands. The disguises worked for years. Of course, not everyone who discovered the truth was scandalized. Sometimes comrades simply shrugged and carried on. One Union soldier wrote about marching with a little fellow who turned out, after an injury, to be a woman. He noted it in his diary almost casually, with more curiosity than outrage. Another officer praised a discovered woman's bravery and wished she could keep serving. It's a reminder that while official rules were rigid, the soldiers in the mud were often more flexible. If you fought, if you carried your weight, if you survived the same misery, you were one of them. Gender became less important than endurance. And as the Civil War ended, these disguised soldiers melted back into everyday life. Some revealed themselves and enjoyed brief fame in newspapers. Others stayed hidden, quietly resuming women's roles. A few, like Albert Cashier, simply kept living as met until the end. But all of them left behind the same quiet echo. Proof that war has never been as simple as men fight, women wait. Because tucked into those vast, smoky armies were hundreds of secrets. Secrets that only came to light decades later, when pension files, hospital logs, or faded diaries revealed the truth. And if you picture it now, drifting towards sleep, it almost feels like a dream sequence. Blue and gray uniforms, stretching across fields, campfires glowing under the stars, and scattered among them, a handful of women in disguise, laughing, marching, loading muskets, their secrets safe in the noise of war. They weren't queens or generals. They didn't decide the fate of nations, but they walked the same roads. They carried the same weight, and in their quiet, stubborn way, they bent the rules of history. And the irony, Barry was one of the most skilled surgeons of the time. He performed one of the first successful cesarean sections, where both mother and child survived. He reformed sanitation and medical care in the army. He had a fierce temper, clashed with superiors, and lived the life of a grumpy, brilliant officer. But because Barry's secret was kept so carefully, even today, historians debate the details. Was Barry a woman living as a man, purely to pursue a medical career? Or was Barry someone we might today recognize as transgender? The answer, lost in the quiet corners of the 1800s, may never be clear. What is clear is that Barry lived and died in uniform, serving under the identity of a man, and only in death was the body revealed to be otherwise. And as we drift here, with the waves of history lapping softly, you can see the pattern forming again. Armies full of men, marching or sailing into endless wars, and tucked inside, a few figures who didn't quite fit. Women in disguise. Not because they thought it would be fun, but because it was their only way forward. They weren't generals. They weren't queens. They weren't the big names history usually remembers. They were footnotes. But those footnotes marched, fought, bled, and died just the same. And somehow, that feels more human than all the crowns and treaties. So let's ease to a pause here. The cannons are quiet for the night. The sails are furled. The women who wore men's coats are folding into the shadows again. In part 3, we'll keep drifting. We'll meet more of them, from forgotten medieval legends to soldiers in the American Civil War, to the odd, quiet cases tucked away in regimental records. But for now, let yourself rest. The disguises are safe. The secrets are kept. And the night is still. Hey again. If you're still with me, then welcome back to the land of long uniforms, muddy boots, and secrets tucked under military coats. So far we've drifted through convent runaways, pirate duos, and Napoleonic cavalry charges. But now, let's cross the Atlantic again, to the 19th century, to a war where disguises didn't just happen occasionally, they happened all the time. That's right, the American Civil War. And here's the part that tends to surprise people. Historians now estimate that somewhere between 400 and 1,000 women disguised themselves as men and fought on both sides of the conflict, Union and Confederate, rich and poor, known and unknown, which means for every 20 men in blue or gray, there was probably at least one young man who wasn't exactly who he seemed. Now, of course, Civil War armies were enormous. Hundreds of thousands of volunteers were pouring in. Many of them were teenagers, barely shaving. Others were middle-aged farmers with leathery skin and missing teeth. So if you were a woman cutting your hair, binding your chest, and giving your name as Sam instead of Sarah, odds were no one would question it too much, especially because recruitment officers weren't looking very hard. They were desperate for numbers. If you could hold a musket, congratulations, you were in. And that's how the floodgates opened. Let's start with one of the more famous names, Sarah Emma Edmonds. Born in Canada in 1814, Sarah had already been disguising herself for years before the war. Her father was abusive, and she fled home as a teenager. To survive, she cut her hair and reinvented herself as a traveling book salesman under the name Franklin Thompson. When the Civil War broke out, Franklin enlisted in the Union Army. And just like that, Sarah was a soldier. She served as a nurse, carrying stretchers and tending wounds under fire. Some accounts even suggest she worked as a spy, slipping behind Confederate lines in various disguises, sometimes as a man, sometimes even as a woman, just not herself. For years, she lived this double life, Franklin Thompson to her comrades, Sarah Edmonds only in private. Eventually, she contracted malaria, fearing discovery if she sought hospital treatment. She deserted, but later, after the war, she resurfaced, told her story, and even successfully applied for a veteran's pension, making her one of the rare women to be formally recognized for service. But Sarah wasn't unique. She was just lucky enough to leave a paper trail. Take Jenny Hodgers, who enlisted under the name Albert Cashier. Albert served in the 95th Illinois Infantry, fought bravely, marched through swamps and rivers, endured the endless campaigns, and when the war ended, Albert just kept being Albert for the next 50 years. He lived as a man, voted as a man, collected his veteran's pension, worked as a handyman. His comrades remembered him fondly, the forgotten Asians. So far, we've lingered mostly in Europe and America. But what about elsewhere? In China, stories exist of women who disguised themselves to join rebel armies during the Ming and Qing dynasties. One such figure is Chu Jin, often called the Chinese Joan of Arc. Though not always disguised as a man, she adopted male dress in daily life, studied martial arts, and became a revolutionary leader in the early 1900s. Executed at just 31, she became a martyr. In Japan, legends tell of women who disguised themselves during the Sengoku period, the age of samurai and constant war. One such figure is Nakano Takeko, who led a unit of female warriors known as the Joshitai during the Boshin War in 1868. She didn't disguise herself, but she fought in men's armor, wielding a naginata with deadly skill. These stories remind us the impulse to step across boundaries wasn't Western alone. It was human. Why did they do it? Across centuries and continents, the disguises echo the same motivation: love, following a husband or lover; survival, fleeing a bad marriage, poverty, or family; adventure, the lure of travel, danger, and glory; identity, a quiet but undeniable sense that living as a man simply fit better; opportunity, access to jobs, wages, or pensions, otherwise impossible. In the end, it's less about deception, more about access. Clothes became keys to battlefields, ships, trades, and freedoms. The quiet reveal. And yet, for most, the disguise didn't last forever. Injuries, illness, or just the creeping suspicion of comrades. Sometimes the reveal ended in admiration, a general shaking his head, smiling at her courage. Sometimes it ended in scandal, prison, whispers, a name erased from records. And sometimes no reveal ever came. They lived, fought, and died as men, their secrets buried with them. The lull of ballads again. If you listen carefully, you can almost hear those tavern songs again. The disguised girl who fought bravely, the discovery in the camp, the laughter, the sorrow, the pride. The tune fades, the candlelight dims, and we're left with the simple truth. This happened everywhere, not once, not twice, but again, and again, and again. And that's where we'll leave part 4. The ballads are quiet. The revolutions are winding down, and the disguised women are stepping back into shadow. Next time, part 5, we'll draw closer to modern times, world wars, secret agents, the 20th century, where disguise takes on new meaning, no longer just about swords and muskets, but about code breaking, espionage, and uniforms made from medicine that women still slipped into anyway. But for now, rest. The ballad is over. The inn is closing, and history is humming you to sleep.